All right. First major error avoided.
Anthony, if you didn't record this, there would have been a lot of grief. Okay?
Yeah. I would have panicked for sure.
Hey, so we're going to start this off. So Anthony and I have been teaming up over the last, several months. Anthony had this idea to start attacking something that most people kind of just talk about, but don't really do a heck of a lot about, and that is handling the work environment when people are coming in that are grieving. And Anthony and his brother wrote this book, and everywhere I looked, and when he came to me and said, "Hey, Mark, I'm thinking about this," and we started collaborating on his consulting business, I looked around and, geez, I couldn't find anything out there that was meaningful. And actually, it's always like grief in the workplace was always like a footnote in somebody's leadership program, right? And they hardly paid attention to it. Well, how do I know Anthony? I was on the board for 𝘈𝘥𝘢𝘕 Incorporated, 𝘈𝘥𝘢𝘕 Inc. for 11 years. And I've met Anthony, over 11 years ago. But Anthony's held all kinds of leadership positions. It's probably easier to talk about what he didn't do than what he did do, but he's held all kinds of financial and human resources and operations, supply chain. And his last tenure at 𝘈𝘥𝘢𝘕, he became a division president, and he did a phenomenal job with what they call the 𝘈𝘥𝘢𝘕 operating model, which is kind of like their version of the Danaher business system. And then Anthony retired out of 𝘈𝘥𝘢𝘕 and kind of came upon this endeavor, which I think is needed greatly. If you really want to talk about respect for people, as we do a lot on LinkedIn with Toyota and everything else, you've got to include this into it, because otherwise it's just missing an arm or a leg, So Anthony, like me, has made many mistakes in his career, especially as it relates to this subject. And he's here to kind of tell you about those things to watch out for, and hopefully, just make the world a better place. And, because at the end of the day, everybody comes to work with grief one way or another. Anthony says 1 in 4, but I think it's 100%. It's just a question of degree.
Right?
And grief is not just, hey, I lost my mother, I lost my spouse, I lost my son. There's other forms of grief too that Anthony's going to talk about, that don't, because people automatically associate grief with death, but in a lot of cases, there's all kinds of other grief that are going on today too. So I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. I'm happy to support him in this endeavor, and I'm also here to remind him to make sure he hits the record button.
Yeah.
But Anthony, let me turn it over to you. And we have some friends on, Dr. M's on, and I see Brad Hagman from GE and maybe a few others. So we have some good friends on there that are really interested in Earl's on, Earl Barone, who's our military guy who is all about leadership. He has a whole business with leadership. So I see a lot of familiar faces on here, and that's great. So looking forward to this session, and we are doing this every month, right, Anthony?
Correct.
Through what, November we're doing this?
I think so, yeah. Yeah,
okay.
We may tack some on at the end, but yeah. So through November.
So I think we're doing the fourth Wednesday of every month?
Correct.
Okay, so there'll be subsequent things going on with this as well as we move forward. So anyway, Anthony, let me turn it over to you, and I'll shut my big mouth.
Super, Mark. Thanks so much. And if anybody's on the West Coast, good morning. If anybody's on the East Coast, good afternoon. And for those of you overseas, good evening. So thanks for joining.
Dr. M, by the way, is in India. So,
Bombay. He and I were talking before you joined. Yeah, it's 8:30 in the evening over there. So I really appreciate him giving up some time this evening to.
I get messages from him all hours of the day. I don't know when he sleeps, but anyway.
Yeah. So we've been progressing through this series, the Respect for Leadership series. This is the third session, and today we're going to talk about the adaptive leadership model that my brother and I talk about and share in the book. But before we get too far down the path here, we'll do a refresher, right? So in case folks hadn't joined in the first two sessions, we'll quickly highlight some of the things we talked about there. Then we're going to talk about the difference between managing uniformly and adaptive leadership. And then we will actually sort of jump into the adaptive leadership model. And then we'll wrap up with a preview of what next month's session is going to look like, which I'm really excited about as well, because we'll go into a little bit more depth on how this model plays into grief in the workplace and leading folks who grieve. So real quick, just a refresher. In the first session, we talked about respect for people, and we laid out a staircase that starts with dignity and respect, but that's sort of just the first rung on the ladder, right? If that's what your definition of respect for people is just not offending anybody, that's sort of a pretty low bar. And we talked about, progressing up these steps, ultimately getting to those last three blocks on the stair step there, which is, acting with courage as a leader, leading with compassion, and being vulnerable, right? If an organization or a leader can instill these steps in the process, in their culture, then they're likely on a great path to demonstrating respect for people and creating an emotionally and psychologically safe environment, which is what's really required here to help deal with grieving employees in the workplace. And as Mark said, and we'll probably touch on this here in a couple of slides, but grief comes from a lot of different avenues, right? It's not just the loss of a loved one. It's any emotionally traumatic event that's significant enough to alter a person's sense of reality, causes them to enter the stages of grief. And so, when you look at it that broadly, and I've got one highlighted in the middle of the page here, folks are dealing with a lot of stuff every single day in their lives. A lot of it we don't even know about. Obviously, some of the more prominent things, you might know about a significant illness, you might know about the loss of a loved one. But oftentimes, organizations don't maybe connect the dot between their initiatives and grief in the workplace, right? When you announce shutting a plant or eliminating jobs or cutting benefits, that shifts people's sense of reality, right? That shifts their view of the job they had, the company they work for, all of those kinds of things. And they will enter the stages of grief. And as we wrap up this session, I have a chart that lays that out fairly nicely and shows how the stages of grief are a component of other things that folks feel when things go on in the workplace that alter their productivity. But the big takeaway from weeks 1 and 2 is this point, right? That grief is a much broader thing in the workplace than just, oh yeah, I know Sally lost her mom last week, right? We've used this before, and I think it's a pretty interesting graphic as a way to think about grief and performance issues and when leaders get involved versus when they should get involved. So if you think about this as like a supercell thunderstorm, where there's things brewing up in the clouds, and then there's this traumatic event that happens, right? The storm actually forms, and that event spawns a tornado. And that tornado, if you think about the tornado as the grief element, and where the tornado hits the ground, or where that grief element, be it personal or organizational, hits the work world, performance issues arise, right? Or can arise. And what typically happens is leaders get involved and wait for the performance issue, and they deal with the performance issue. And that just compounds the issue for the individual or the team, right? It complicates the issue because now not only am I dealing with the grief, now you're telling me I may lose my job, right? And so what we encourage leaders to do is to engage as early in the process as they can, in order to help employees actually excel at work while this change is going on in their lives, right? And today we're going to talk about a leadership model that helps do that. As Mark talked about, no organization is immune to this. Every leader, every person's going to face this issue at some point. It's estimated 1 in 4 are impacted by this on a daily basis. Some studies that have been done by the Grief Recovery Institute suggest that it's $100 billion a year cost in lost productivity. And it largely goes unnoticed, right? Because it's people taking time off work. It's people staring at computers. It's people crying. You just can't see the waste as clearly as you can scrap or other things that, you can't necessarily see the inbox stacking up, right? So it's really, truly a hidden cost, but it's quite staggering. And I've had a couple of people ask about grief and workplace burnout. And I actually found 2 studies, well, they weren't really studies, 2 articles by the Mayo Clinic that described the symptoms of grief in one article and described the symptoms of workplace burnout in another article. And those two, they could have been the same article, right? Which has led me to believe, and as I think back through the times when I've experienced workplace burnout and when I've experienced it with others, the 2 are really very similar and are in fact the same, right? I think a big element of workplace burnout is actually grief playing out in the employee or in the team. And so if you compound those numbers on top of, or if you add those numbers on top of the ones I've already stated, right? Studies have shown that workplace burnout costs $190 billion a year in annual healthcare costs. And, folks are 60% more likely to take sick days, which actually totaled 550 million in the year that the study was done. They're 2.5 times more likely to leave the organization. 70% of the employees are disengaged. And so the costs really add up here, right? The amount of money that grief in the workplace costs organizations is overwhelming. It's staggering. And, as I think about burnout in the workplace, the thing that shifts there is, the employee starts to feel like this wasn't what I signed up for, right? That's the sense of reality that shifts for them. This wasn't what I signed up for when I joined this organization, right? I didn't sign up to work 12 hours a day. I didn't sign up for the weekends. I didn't sign up for, all of this, my job seems to have changed. I can't seem to ever get ahead, right? Whatever the things are that are causing the employee to feel burned out is really a shift in their perspective, in their reality of what their job or what their leader or what their organization really was prior to all of the events sort of compounding and causing them to feel this enormous amount of stress. So workplace burnout, I think, is an argument can be made that there is a component of grief associated with that.
Hey, Anthony, can I just make a
absolutely
comment
yeah
about what you're talking about? There's a couple of things I want to say, but I'm going to hold one for later because I think you're going to get into it. As you might know, I had a financial background before I figured out what I was going to do with my life. And I was a CFO, and Anthony also has a financial background.
Mm-hmm.
And those costs, Anthony, go back to that last slide for a minute.
Well, that might be easier said than done, but
no, okay, forget it.
There we go.
Oh, there you go. So I like to always use real world analogies on things, right? Why isn't this really noticed? I mean, these are staggering numbers, and my sense anyway is that they're way underestimated, okay? Because it is hidden, right? But anyway, so here's a thought, right? When an airplane crashes and we lose 200 people, it makes the news. It could result in all kinds of things like shutting down an airline, for example, or shutting down the 737 MAX, right? Because we lost 200 people all at the same time. However, what doesn't make the news is things like, and I've done the math on this, and by the way, these aren't my numbers, these are the government's numbers. We lose 1,400 people a day in the United States to medical errors and infections in hospitals. 1,400 are going to die today on average. And that never gets mentioned because it's spread out. It's Uncle Joe in Seattle. It's Aunt Mary down in Miami. It's, it's all spread out. And so the nobody notices, and it never really reaches, the front page of the paper, if you will, when 1,400 people a day died to screw ups. I mean, absolutely screw ups on all kinds of things, right? But the 200 people that died in an airplane, boom, everybody knows about it. Front page we'll talk about for the next 5 days. So that's the analogy I like to make with this, because this is so subtle and so blended into the fabric of our organizations that we don't see that big hit, right? And all of a sudden, before you know it, we start accepting stuff like this as normal. In lean, we always talk about identifying the abnormal that you used to consider normal, right? But we then look at something like this and we just all of a sudden just say, that's just the way things are, right? Because I can't go grab a jet engine and fix it, right? I've got nothing really to do in that regard. That's why what Anthony is doing is giving you the tools, and his company will do that, to actually grab that jet engine, right? And put the fix in place so that this stuff is no longer just kind of part of your fabric of your culture. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that analogy out because it's frustrating to me that people don't see this, but then again, they may be going through grief too, right?
Right. And I really like what the phrase you use there, right? It's subtle and it becomes the normal, right? Because it is so subtle, right? It almost becomes the fabric of the organization as you mentioned it. So I appreciate those comments, Mark.
Yeah. Hey, Anthony, can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. No. Back on the previous slide, because I was watching maybe a couple of weeks ago. It was a video on bullying, and the speaker was relaying, similar numbers to this of the impact on bullying, and it's not just the people that are directly bullied; it's the secondary effect of people who know people that have been bullied, that that the organization accepts that type of behavior. And I think it's the same thing, with these numbers here. These are dramatically underrepresent the impact of grief, because even if employees aren't experiencing grief themselves, maybe they're not, and maybe they don't even know the coworker that is experiencing a grief event. The way that the company deals with that grief event, are they empathetic, or is it, we don't care? I was just talking with a gentleman at GE who's retiring this week, and it's like there's no retirement party or retirement acknowledgement. That's retirement is a, I think for many people, it's a major milestone. It's a, but a potentially grief event. But to have the company completely ignore that, that milestone and celebrate their service to the company, it reflects poorly, and the impact is not just on that individual, but on the rest of the other employees who see that disrespect practiced by their company.
Absolutely.
Hey, Brad, come on. I mean, parties are expensive. Get your act together.
Yeah, boy, have I heard that before. Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Brad. I had this experience and was reminded of it. I was responsible for shutting a plant down when I was working for Batesville Casket Company, and we had one of the benchmarks that we held in front of ourselves were, not the 200 people. We wanted to make sure we were taking care of the 200 people who were directly impacted, but there were 2,300 other people in our other facilities that were watching how we did this as well, right?
Yeah.
Excellent point. Excellent point. The other thing that we talked about in previous weeks was, it's easy to believe that people don't want to talk about this because it's too personal, it's too emotional, it's uncomfortable, it's all of those things, it's awkward. But there's been quite a body of work that has come out over the last couple of years. These all happen to be from Harvard Business Review, but there are other sources. McKinsey did a report. There are other sources that say people really do want to talk about this at work, right? They want a culture where it's okay. I mentioned vulnerability in the slide before, or a couple of slides before, and I mentioned compassion and courage, right? Your people want an environment where they can raise their hand if they need to and say, I'm struggling and I need help, right? And a lot of organizations, through no fault, by the way, I'm not being overly critical or trying to be overly critical of organizations or its leaders, but because this has sort of just become the fabric of the company, right? The way we do business, we oftentimes send signals that say it's not okay to raise your hand, right? Because if you raise your hand, you're no longer going to be considered top talent, right? Because it's a weakness, and we got to work on that. And so the point here is people do want to talk about it, but leaders don't know how to have these conversations. And that's really the point of the 6 or 7 sessions that Mark and I are putting on over the next several months. And then we just talked about how little that's really been written about grief from this perspective, right? There's a bunch written about grief at the individual level and grief counseling and the stages of grief and all of that. But there's not very much written about grief and leadership and how organizations should deal with this. And so that was the challenge that my brother and I sort of decided to take on as we wrote the book and started our training organization. And so I'll use this slide to set up as we now move forward and talk about adaptive leadership, right? But, you know, I love this quote, a leader, and I think about it in terms of even the lean journey, right? As a leader, you should always start with where your people are before you take them to where you want to go. And we're going to talk about that in the context of adaptive leadership. And I'll just jump into it rather than getting ahead of myself. So when we talk about adaptive leadership, I like to compare it to its alternative, which is managing uniformly, right? And I have been guilty of managing uniformly in my career. In fact, I give an example of it in the book where I actually wound up terminating someone more likely because I had not adapted my leadership style than it was that he was incompetent, right? I actually don't think the person looking back on it was incompetent. I was leading them, right? My leadership style, I was leading uniformly, and the way I was leading didn't align with his needs at the time at his point in his career. So managing uniformly is when a leader latches on to a single leadership style that they're comfortable with, that they are successful with. And by the way, that style does not have to be, I was talking with someone yesterday in a podcast interview, and their comment was, well, that sounds like you're talking about a very autocratic sort of dictatorial leader, command and control. And the reality is, no, I could be talking about anybody, right? In my particular instance, I had latched on to a very high engagement, high empowerment, high participative leadership style. And that wasn't the leadership that this individual needed. He was new in the role, new to the organization. He needed more guidance, more direction. He needed me to actually be more sort of command and control while he got his feet on the ground. And so I was frustrating him by saying, hey, I want you to go figure this out. And he really wasn't to a point where he could take on all of those characteristics that would be required there. And I was getting frustrated and he was getting frustrated, and ultimately performance slipped. And I wound up dealing with the performance when in fact, the problem was I was managing uniformly. And so you latch onto this leadership style and you apply it to all situations, to all individuals. It's disconnected from their career and development needs, and it contributes to stress and anger. And that's especially true when you're dealing with traumatized employees. And as you're going to see here in the next couple of slides, we laid this out on a matrix, and people are moving in that matrix all the time. And the person who manages uniformly never recognizes that, right? And so, you know, like a clock that's broken, it tells time correctly twice a day, but most of the day it's not operating correctly, right? Same thing happens here. Occasionally, the person who's managing uniformly, their style matches the needs of the person. But most of the time you're at a sync, and that gets very frustrating for both parties, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that and some of the things that play out when that occurs.
Hey, Anthony,
Yes, sir.
We've got our friend 𝘚𝘿𝘺𝘀𝘀 on who is a Marine combat veteran. And I was just curious if Earl doesn't mind answering this question. Is the military more along what Anthony just talked about from a leadership perspective, or is it more adaptive, or is it based on individual? And why is that question important? Because you will be dealing as leaders with veterans, okay, who may come into your company and just see a sea of gray where they came out of a very, defined environment. So, but I'm just curious, Earl, if the military can you categorize the military in that regard in one style or another, or is it based on the individual?
Yeah, well, I think it's like every organization, right? You got some folks who buy into the kind of Hollywood version of military leadership, the spitting, the slobbering, the screaming, the yelling, and all that good stuff. And well, we call those bad leaders in the military too. The great leaders do exactly what Anthony is talking about here. They take the individual as much as possible. The military gets wrapped up in this uniformity and all that, but it's really there's the foundation of great military leadership really is love, getting to know the person, getting to figure out how to deal with them, how to motivate them, and how to get them moving along. I've told both Mark and Anthony this. One of the best pieces of leadership advice I got early in my career was from a gunnery sergeant who explained to me, he said, Marine Corps leadership is this simple. You have to be willing to send your troops into combat knowing that they could die, but you have to love them so much that doing so rips your heart out. And I think that that's it right here is you can't get to that level of care, concern for your people if you're not taking the time to get to know who they are, how they need to be led, how their personal life is going, how their career is going, what are the things that drive them. You got to do these things that Anthony's talking about here. This is just, this is great leadership.
Well, thank you very much, Earl.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You always have a great perspective on things.
I appreciate that.
So Dr. M actually asked a question as well here, and he's asked how adaptive leadership is different from situational leadership, and they are very similar, right? They are very similar. We have just used a slightly different model, I guess, but it is very similar, right? That's really what we're talking about is recognizing where people are in their role, where they are in their career development, where they are in a given situation or assignment, and where they are in their personal lives. And I guess if I had to make a distinguishing factor or point out a distinguishing element, I think it would be around the personal lives situation, right? Situational leadership talks about competence and confidence. And having actually taught situational leadership on several occasions to organizations and actually some customers, it never really delves into the personal side of things, right? It's always about the business side of things, and I don't believe it recognizes the personal element quite the way we do here with adaptive leadership. If I was going to have to, if you asked me to give you one sort of critical element difference, I think this is it. But at the end of the day, situational leadership is talking about moving fluidly through that model of leadership, and we're talking about moving fluidly through a very, something similar. So they are very similar, but this one focuses or draws attention to the elephant in the room, which is sort of that personal side of things and what people are feeling, and what are the implications of things that are going on in their lives, including their work life and their personal life, that are all brought to bear in the workplace. I think that's the significant difference. So great question. Appreciate that. Okay, so adaptive leadership. I do want to make some distinctions here, just so that folks we're all on the same page. So we're talking about adapting your leadership style. We're not talking about adapting your principles as a leader, right? We're talking about a leadership culture here, not just a tool that you pull out and use occasionally, right? This would actually be something that we would encourage leaders to do all the time. And if you'll do it all the time, then respect for people, emotional, safe, and psychological safety, all of those things, the courage and the compassion and the vulnerability, all of those things will become apparent to people if you use this model all the time, if this becomes the way you lead. We're talking about a very people first oriented approach, but let's not kid ourselves here. This is not about, just soft leadership. In fact, I would argue it's one of the most difficult types of leadership to actually put in place and to lead by. But this is a people first, mission always perspective on things, right? This is not just, well, we're going to do whatever, we're going to make the person happy, right? That's not what this is about, right? This is about learning how to become a more effective leader, to support people when they need the support the most, but yet get the results that the organization needs, right? That's what we're really talking about here. It's leadership with purpose, intention, and compassion. And it's leadership to develop, grow, and support people, right? So the couple of big points here, the first one I think is really important, right? We're talking about adjusting your style, not adjusting your principles here. Assuming that the leader has good principles to start with. So I guess I should have put that caveat out there. But so that's what we're talking about here.
On the topic of, if you don't mind for 1 second, on the topic of principles, right? You hear us talk in the lean world a lot, and I talk a lot about this, of the safety, quality, delivery, cost hierarchy, where each one is more important than the other. And many of those drive the ones on the bottom, right? And safety, of course, always being top. But normally when we talk about safety, people's mind automatically gravitate to the workplace safety, like, cuts, spills, falls, things like that, the physical stuff. But an insurance executive said to me one day, well, how does safety apply here? Is it ergonomics? Is it paper cuts? No, it's what you're talking about. It's psychological safety. And so I think we've got to think about the SQDC hierarchy as a principle in a little bit broader respect as we think about safety. And so when I hear this, what you're talking about, my mind goes right back to that principle that we should all be following anyway.
Right.
Many talk about it, but of course, it's all talk and they don't really do it. But the SQDC principle, this is all about that. And I just wanted to bring that point out.
Right. Great point. Here's just a quote from Simon Sinek, who happens to be somebody that I enjoy reading his stuff. Right. The true price of leadership is the willingness to place the needs of others above your own. That's the compassion component and the courage component that we talked about earlier, right? Do you care about as much about me as you do yourself? And are you willing to do what's right, even if it brings negative consequences on you, right? And great leaders truly care about those they are privileged to lead. Earl just mentioned that in his conversation about the military and leadership in the military. And quite frankly, those three components that I mentioned, two of the three that I mentioned, compassion and courage, I had the privilege of seeing and being in the presence of a retired colonel, Arthur Athens, who actually teaches leadership at the Naval Academy. And he teaches the 3 C's of leadership: competence, courage, and compassion. And he will tell you that's those things are the things that get Marines to follow you into battle. It's not the yelling and the screaming and all the other stuff, the Hollywood image that Earl mentioned. So that's what we're talking about here. So I'd like to go into what the model really looks like. And this will get fairly detailed, and I sort of apologize for that, but I thought it was important to actually cover the model. So we're going to talk about, we've used the 9 block in the book, and in our, if we come into an organization, we use a 9 block matrix of performance and potential. This could be a 4 block. It could be what and how. The principles will apply. In fact, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is not forcing an organization to, this is going to be actually kind of funny, right? Not forcing, we would be violating our own adaptive leadership principles if we came in and forced an organization to shift everything that they do to use our format, right? What we actually try to do is go in and understand what the organization has in place and then adapt our principles and fit them into what you're already doing as much as possible. But if you didn't have anything, a way to measure your talent, we would suggest a 9 block of performance and potential, right? Laid over top of that are the 5 attributes that we talk about in our book of stewardship, of adaptive leadership, right? And so these are the 5 things that leaders would be looking for their employees to demonstrate, right? Stewardship, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and then those 4 elements then dictate communication frequency, which is the interaction between the leader and the employee or the team, right? So stewardship, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and communication frequency. Those are the attributes. And I'm going to take a moment here to just define those. So stewardship, that's the level of ownership, accountability, and competence that a person demonstrates, right? Trust is the belief that you have in a person's skills, abilities, integrity, and character, right? And so trust is a natural outcome of a person's stewardship. Is this person doing everything that they need to do to advance in their competency level, to get the job done? Are they taking accountability for their work and their output? Are they getting results, right? So trust flows from that. Empowerment is then the amount of authority that the leader is willing to give to that employee to determine how a task or assignment should be done. And collaboration is the level of sharing of information and decision-making authority, which is really interesting. I've been working with another organization to help them find a CEO, and they're looking for a CEO who actually sort of has this in their nature, right? They're looking for a very people first type of CEO, someone who gets this sort of leadership style. And several of the candidates in their assessment, it came back that they were likely to delegate details, but not authority, which is a real pitfall of a leader, in my opinion, in certain situations. And then the last piece here is this notion of communication frequency, or the cadence by which or in which you talk to your people as individuals or as a team, right? And at what level is approval required, right? And ironically or interestingly, communication frequency in our model is inversely proportionate to the level of stewardship, trust, empowerment, and collaboration that you observe in your team or in your people. And so here's those elements sort of in pictorial form. As I mentioned, when stewardship, trust, empowerment, and collaboration are low, communication frequency needs to be high. And that's the mistake that I made in the example that I gave earlier that we talk about in our book, where I fired that individual for performance issues. They were new in their role. They were new to the company. And I was treating them as if they were a high performer, high potential, right? As if they were very high on these elements of stewardship, trust, empowerment, and collaboration. And so I was not spending enough time with this individual, right? I wasn't giving them the direction that they needed, right? I was doing more sort of empowering and coaching, and that wasn't what they needed. And it was reflected in their performance. And so that's what communication frequency means. There is that cadence of, when you've got people who are really low on the scale, you need to be with them. They need lots of direction, I guess is the point. Where folks on the other end of the spectrum, once you spend the time collaborating with them and talking to them about how do they think this assignment should be structured, what do they think the goals should be, how would they set this up, what do they think the work plan should be, right? Once you sort of come to agreement on all of that, you let them go, right? And you don't need to be constantly watching them, looking over their shoulder, telling them to go fill out this spreadsheet and come back and talk to me about it. But some leaders behave that way because that's the style that they're comfortable with, right? And that becomes very frustrating. So we overlay the 9 block there, and the red, yellow, greens will make sense here in a moment. And then we start to talk about, okay, so if the person is in the lower left-hand box, very low stewardship, low on the trust scale, low on empowerment, low on collaboration, you want to be very high in communication frequency with that person, right? You want to be more directing than supportive or coaching. At the other end of the spectrum is the high potential, high performer, right? We've just talked about that. Very high on the scales. You're turning lots of things over to them, not just delegating the details. You are actually delegating the authority here and the decision-making, right? You're not abdicating, but you are delegating. And the difference there is, it's still up to the leader to make the call. But you're turning it's a highly participative, highly collaborative approach to whatever the project or the situation is that you're embarking on. Then you have the person in the middle, who is advancing in their career, right? And you can begin to delegate more, collaborate more, communicate a little less frequently. Whoops. And then, obviously you've got everybody else on the matrix, right? So you move from the red to the yellow to the greens. And your leadership style has to adapt as people, right? Not everybody in your team fits in one box, right? They're all in different boxes, and they will all be in different boxes at different times. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So here's your team, right? So we have Bob. Bob's new to the role and the company. He's more confident maybe than he is competent. He asks lots of questions, but he needs lots of direction, right? And then you got Jill, who's developing at a good pace. She's got some potential to do more. She performs well in her role, but she probably needs another 18 to 24 months in her role before she's ready to kind of move on. You got Johan. He's the longest tenure in your department. He's your go-to guy, right? He's the typical high performer. He's got all the skill in the world, but he lacks the will or the confidence to be promoted. So he's sort of up in that upper left-hand corner. And then you got Nikki. She's your rock star, right? She's in a development role. She's high performing, high potential. And she's likely ready to take on more responsibilities inside of the next 12 months, maybe even as already now. So as you plot these folks on the graph, right, you got Bob down at the bottom, you got Jill in the middle, you got Nikki up in the upper right-hand corner, and you got Johan in the upper left-hand corner. The interesting thing here, and I can talk about it here, but you'll see it on the next slide. The interesting thing is Johann is sort of a very interesting character in this whole thing, because sometimes Johann acts a little bit more like Bob, and sometimes he acts a little bit more like Nikki, right? There's some things where he is very confident, very competent, and very comfortable with, and he can be delegated to and given lots of room to run and lots of reign. And then there's other times where you don't really need to direct him, but he doesn't see how he fits, right? How his skill set fits with maybe what you're asking him to do, or this is new to him. And so he needs a little bit more coaching, right? A little bit more support to help him wrap his head around and give him the confidence to go do this. So he's sort of an interesting, that people in the high performer ranks are very interesting leadership. They pose a very interesting leadership challenge or opportunity. And so, when you are not adapting your leadership, right? When you are managing uniformly, some things begin to play out, right? Depending on your style. If you have a very sort of autocratic style, command and control style, very hands-on style, a person like Nikki will feel to you like she's running off the farm, right? And like she's always, that like her motto is, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, right? And in reality, that may not be Nikki's fault. It may be that you are not using the right leadership approach with her, right? And the same thing as I described with Bob down in the lower left-hand corner, where my leadership style didn't align with theirs. Bob was getting very frustrated by the fact that he didn't feel like he was getting the support and the direction he needed from me, right? And it played out in his performance. And so on the next chart, so there's, Bob would be down in the lower left and Jill would be in the middle. Nikki is up in the upper right. And then you got Johann, who kind of, he floats on this scale a little bit. But I think you can see how if you are a sort of a one-trick pony leader, if you've only got one style, if you only approach people one way, it becomes an issue for the team. And this is especially true when a traumatic event happens, because a traumatic event may happen in one of these people's lives and it will shift where they are, right? They will not be the same person on Monday that they were on Friday before the event occurred. And leaders need to be very sensitive to that. And because we're talking about grief here, or let me put it another way, because we're talking about a very emotional component of leadership here, it's awkward and it's uncomfortable and it is emotional. And so leaders tend to avoid those conversations, and through that avoidance, they may not adapt their style, and through not adapting their style, it just compounds the problem. And that's how performance issues begin to unfold. And when it happens on an individual basis, as Mark and Brad had described, it sort of begins to eat away at the culture of the team, right? Because the rest of the team is watching how things are unfolding. And it starts to erode their confidence in the organization and in the leader. And it starts to become a place where they begin to question whether or not the values that they have really align with the values of the organization, and morale begins to slip and engagement begins to slip. And before you know it, you got a team of burnt out employees, to use the terms that are sort of popular today. But in reality, what you have is people who have begun to sense a shift in their reality at work, right? And a leader who may not be responding to that is really what's happening under the surface. Yeah.
I want to jump on what you just said. First of all, I need to advise you privately that you should check out the child labor laws. I think Bob looks a little young to me.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he is. He is.
But no, in all seriousness, no. So let me, again, I like to go back to real life examples that maybe have nothing to do with business. So, and many of you know that I lost my son in, well, it's going to go on 11 years now, back in 2010. Yeah, he got killed in Afghanistan. Now, at the same time, his brother was over there in, 20 minutes after he found out about Stephen, he got into a firefight, okay, with the Taliban. So he comes home and Scott's writing a book. And the book is called Surviving Son. Okay, it's not out yet, but it's a really cool book, and a lot of it has to do with what you're talking about here as far as grief. But what I wanted to tell you is that we just saw the first draft the other day, and as my wife and I were reading it, now you got to remember, he suffered and suffers from PTSD, and so do we with losing our son. But as we read this book, we said, well, wait a minute, no, that's not what happened. No, that fact is wrong. No, that's not right. No, that's not what happened there. And that, and then even my wife and I, between us, are arguing about, no, that's not how it went down. No, I did that. No. The point is this: who the heck knows what the facts are? I mean, we were and still are to a great degree, under this spell of grief, right? And we always will be. But Anthony's making a point here is that, just think about performance. So I look at this book and I said, well, last night we had a big conversation with my son and my wife about who is right and does it even matter? And maybe the message more is how perception gets so, I don't know if it's distorted, but altered. And so, Johan might think he's ready to become the CEO of the whole organization because he thinks his perception is different than the way his leader is viewing him. Okay. And then you enter the fact that if any of these people are suffering from some semblance of grief, their view of the world totally gets distorted. They may think they're doing a phenomenal job and kicking the heck out of it, right? And you're sitting there saying, hey, I ain't cutting it, man. It's not working, right? And if you don't recognize the fact as a leader that the people who are going through grief are not going to see things, I don't even want to unfairly say they're not going to see it clearly, okay? They're just not going to, they're going to see it differently maybe, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, maybe you're wrong, okay? But it doesn't matter. The fact remains that grief alters your view of things and your perceptions and all that. And you got to understand that. And it's not a question of who's right, who's wrong. It's just that understanding how Johan sees the world. And if you're not communicating with him, then guess what? You are going to be on a different page. And then that's when you get into this whole where you're not performing, right?
Right.
So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there because there's a real life example, believe it or not, it just happened over the last couple of days into last night. And we were just shocked about how differently we saw the events of Stephen getting killed and the aftermath of the funeral and the press and the governor and the whole thing, right? It was just so unbelievably shocking how we all three of us saw it differently.
Right.
Anyway, I'll throw that out to you. Okay.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And you're right. And when a leader does not recognize sort of the elephant in the room, what happens is it further compounds the situation, right? And it further distorts the reality because these folks are looking for the leader to maybe be more compassionate, be more sensitive, be more supportive, and the leader's just ignoring it because I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with this. I've never been trained on this. It's uncomfortable. It's emotional. Man, I'm just going to treat these folks like things are normal. And then they start to feel disenfranchised, which is what we've been talking about on a couple of other instances here that Mark's brought up and Brad's brought up as well. And when they feel disenfranchised, right, that starts the slip, right, of performance. Okay.
I think if I could make a point, Tony, is that especially in the environment we're living in today with COVID and so much working remote, all of, when everybody was in the office, managers had daily interface with their employees. They could pick up on the nonverbal clues that maybe something was wrong, something was happening. But with all this remote work, the mental health, suffering of people, what people are going through, that's not visible. It may be, something may have happened in their life, and maybe in normal times it wouldn't have been that great, but because of the isolation and loneliness from working remote, it's completely compounded, and that remote working environment further prevents the manager from really seeing or maybe picking up on what's going on or the severity of it.
Right. No, it's a great point, right? Because I can't really judge your body language and pick up the nonverbal cues on this Zoom call from this little thumbnail picture that I see of you, right?
Yeah.
And so, it becomes even harder for the leader. And so leaders tend to they tend to act sympathetically and not empathetically. And what I mean by that is they will do the courtesy, how's everybody doing? But that's not, everybody's going to say, I'm fine, right? Everybody's going to say, I'm fine. And it really takes more than that, right? It takes sitting down. In fact, in the book, we talk about it as next level leadership, right? Whatever you think you should do, if you think you should do an email, no, you should probably call the person. And if you think you should call the person, maybe you should actually do a Zoom call just one-on-one so you can actually see them, right? You should try to take it to the next level. I'm dealing with an organization right now, and this example will come up again next week or next month in the session. They have announced that they're closing a facility. They announced it in June. They're closing it in August. About 3 weeks ago, so grief throughout the entire workplace, right? This is a long-standing company, but they've been acquired, and the new parent is shutting down the organization. So turmoil in the workplace. The leaders are doing a phenomenal job of being present for their people and sitting down with them, and the organization has done some nice work about providing benefits that they wouldn't normally have had to have provided and those kinds of things, trying to do what they can. But a gentleman with 3 kids, 2 months, the youngest is 2 months old. I don't know the age of the oldest. He goes home. His wife was suffering from postpartum depression, finds all 3 kids suffocated, and his wife had attempted to commit suicide and was unsuccessful. Devastated. Right? Absolutely devastating. And it makes the news. So everybody in the town knows what's gone on. So he can't really hide from this. And these leaders have been beside themselves on how do we deal with this individual, right? What do we do here? And they've done some remarkable things. But the point that I wanted to make out, or that I wanted to bring out here is, and this is an hourly worker. This isn't a vice president, right? This is an hourly worker, but it is a small company. They have gone to his house every single day just to check on him and to bring him food, see how he's doing. They're having a hard time talking with him, right? Because they don't know how to really approach the subject. And we're going to probably talk a little bit. I'm hoping after they read the book that they'll reach out to me and I'll share some thoughts with them. But they're beginning to think about, one, they don't want this guy worried about needing to get paid. So they're going to continue to pay him, even though he's not coming to work right now. They're trying to think about, we have had some conversations about, from his perspective, he doesn't want to deal with large crowds now. The number one thing my brother hears from families that he deals with is, and my brother's a funeral director, the number one comment he hears is, I'm dreading going back to work. And so this guy is dreading going back to work. How do we make this easier for him? And so they're doing all the right things. But the point that I wanted to raise there was, in an environment where it would be really easy for them to say, well, we just need to move on. These guys are going out of their way and actually visiting this employee at home because they want to make the eye contact. They know a phone call or an email isn't going to get it done. And they're really concerned about him. And it has paid dividends already, because the rest of the organization has witnessed how they are behaving, and the type of culture that even in a plant shutdown situation that they continue to instill. And folks are holding this leadership team in very high regard, even during a time when they've made an incredibly difficult decision. So thanks for sharing that perspective, Brad. All right, so some images to remember, right? So as I've ended every one of these sessions, if you don't really remember anything that I've said up to this point, if you can keep these pictures in mind. We talked about how employee burnout and workplace burnout and grief, this is a little bit bigger picture than the one that I put up earlier. You can see how similar the symptoms of the two are, and why we believe that there is an element of grief that is present in employee burnout. Apparently, I have my slide build, my animations out of sequence here, but we talked about the difference between adaptive leadership and managing uniformly, and when at all possible, we want leaders to not manage uniformly, but to learn how to adapt their style and fluidly move through that matrix that we presented. We talked about the matrix and the elements of the elements that leaders should look for for their people to for their folks to demonstrate that help to inform what leadership style they might need to put in place. And quite frankly, next month, we will actually talk about the leadership styles that as you flow through that, we've sort of talked about them already, moving from directing all the way up to sort of supporting. But we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out, particularly in a grief environment in next month's session. And so I think we've started all over again there. So let's just escape here and see where we are. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about sort of what we really do here in GriefLeaders, right? So if you think about a productivity chart, right, where there's a normal productivity level that's achieved over time, then you think about that image of the grief event that happens and the tornado that begins to form of grief, right? And you overlay that on these, the behaviors that begin to develop because of what has transpired, right? And the ones in the gold there are actually the 5 stages of grief, right? But people, when this change event happens, when this traumatic event happens, people will go through denial, anxiety, shock, confusion, right? They'll get all the way down to undirected energy, which is sort of when they hit the bottom of the productivity scale. And then they make their way back up as they work their way to acceptance, and then ultimately, back to adapting to their new reality. And what we really do on 2 levels, one is on a personal level and the other's on an organizational level, is we come in and with training and with processes around respect for people, emotional safety, and adaptive leadership. We help the organization or the individual lessen that curve, right? So they don't hit the trough as low, and performance recovers more quickly through working through the model that we've sort of developed, right? That we come in and help organizations with, and it's around the 3 pillars of respect for people, emotional safety, and adaptive leadership. That's what we do, and the earlier an organization will engage us in the change process, obviously the better the results will be. So just wanted to mention that, because we've gotten to the end of a couple of these and people are like, well, okay, so what do you guys really do? Well, we come in It starts with an assessment, and then we customize training, and then we work through coaching and the change. If it's an organizational change situation, we work through a change model with the organization. And that's what we really do. On an individual level, helping grieving employees excel at work on an individual level, we come in and deal with the leader, the employee, and the team sort of on an individual level. So, all right, good place to stop. And like I said, next month on August 25th, 11 o'clock Eastern time, we will talk further about the model. And I'm actually going to invite a guest speaker to next month's session. She is she's the owner of a company called Pradco, and they have worked with us to actually develop a proprietary adaptive leadership index. So part of the assessment that we do for an organization, right, we're coming in to look at a couple of things. One is we're trying to assess really the emotional culture of the organization, its capacity for change, its respect for people culture, and its leadership culture. And that's where this adaptive leadership index comes into play. And it's part of the assessment that we do when we come into an organization, because through that assessment, we can then begin to actually form a profile of what the leadership culture of the organization looks like, and how adaptive might the leadership already be, or is this a blind spot for the organization? So she's going to come and she'll spend a little bit of time actually stepping us through the index and how it works and what it is. And so that's next month on the 25th. So I will open it up for comments or questions. Somebody needed to leave. Brad needed to leave. That's okay. Appreciate that. So please type the comments in the chat box, and we will try to answer them if there are any. And if not, then we are basically at the end of the session here. Thank you. Very interesting, Peter. Appreciate the comment. Thank you so much. Do appreciate that. Thanks for participating. It's always a pleasure to have everybody online with us. So appreciate that. All right. I do appreciate everybody's.
Anthony, I require a minute. Dr. M here.
Yeah.
Just want a clarification. The 9 blocks that you said, each block, is it quantitatively defined or qualitatively defined or intuitively placed? Each block of the 9 block. Yeah,
it's largely an intuitive kind of thing, right? It's measuring within an organization. If you're using performance and potential, organizations tend to have their definitions of what performance looks like and what potential looks like. And so it's certainly more subjective than objective, and it's more intuitive than quantitative. But it's a combination of, their performance review and whatever that looks like, and then however they measure potential in their organization, right? Which is typically around some behavioral model. But it's largely, it's much more intuitive and subjective than quantitative and objective.
So Anthony, if I get you right, in each organization that you work with, you would redefine each of these blocks suitable to that organization. Am I right?
Yes. What we would do is we would look to the systems that they already have in place, and then bring adaptive leadership, respect for people, and emotional safety. Bring those principles to bear, rather than telling them they had to throw out what they already have and move to what we have. We would adapt our leadership training and our processes to try to fit what they already have in place, assuming they believe that it's effective, right? If they're not happy with what they have and they're looking for another platform, then we would certainly move them to what we describe. But we can, the leadership principles that we teach and the culture that we try to help organizations build, we have found that we can adapt those principles. We can help inculcate those principles into the system that the organization already has.
Right. Anthony and Mark, thanks a lot. The flow was extremely good. I did not know how the time passed. So thank you very much and grateful to you. I will see you next month. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. M. Appreciate it, and have a great night.
Dr. M, get some sleep.
Yeah.
We need you fresh. We need you on LinkedIn. We need you fresh.
It's 9:40 now. Okay.
Have a good night.
Good night.
All right. If there's nothing else,
Anthony, I have only one. I would not even
sure.
comment. I will just add on your this potential performance assessment metrics. It's rather for the young leaders, which are younger even than myself. Then this assessment should be performed on a regular basis. It's one point. And the second point, which is very important, which you covered a little bit, that the person might have different potential in different areas. So you should also follow that. And from that perspective, then you could define if that person is good either for the line management activities or the project assignments and the approach for the further development.
Right. Right. No, agree totally. Right. It should be, this should be looked at no less than once a year. Twice a year is probably better. And it should, again, that's we're assuming here that an organization already has some type of talent assessment process in place. But yes, it should be, and a performance appraisal system in place. But it should be done more. It's not let's do it once, put it in a book, and then we don't worry about it again, for another 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. It should be done at least once a year, preferably twice. But the leader needs to be very sensitive on an ongoing basis about what the organization is bringing to bear on its people and what is going on in their people's personal lives. Because while you might not formally move a person from one block to another, on any given day or month, they may move themselves because their father just got diagnosed with Alzheimer's and they're shaken, right? You wouldn't necessarily formally move them. So for instance, I coach a gentleman here in Batesville, Indiana, whose wife had been battling stage 4 metastatic breast cancer for 5 years. They never moved him formally from the high performing, high potential block in the upper right-hand corner of that matrix. But they treated him very differently throughout those 4 years, right? He remained a high performing, high potential, but his leader was very cognizant of when she was going through when they were changing her treatment protocol and things were going to get rough at home, right? And they were very cognizant of the fact that he couldn't travel the way the job might need to be traveled. So they figured out ways to bring development experiences to him, as opposed to having him have to go to the development experiences. And then there were times when she was doing well, responding well, things were great, and they could treat him. They could treat him just like he was the high performing, high potential. And then other times he would come in and raise his hand and say, I need help here. And so they were very adaptive in the way they handled him.
Yeah, this is a great point, because what I have seen from experience, especially when you have like recent graduates which are on the low performance level and in general maturity,
right?
You could not push anybody just, okay, be better, develop yourself. It doesn't work. That comes from the core of the person itself.
Right.
But when you have the person on the high level of potential performance, this is the role of the leader to help the person go through some difficult situations. And in such a way, it's balancing. So you started yourself at your own will. We do respect you. But when we see that you are well developed and you have certain things which influence your performance and your communication style in general. It's the very first thing which changes.
Right.
Then
Right.
as a leader, you'll help them. Yeah.
Right.
It's a good point.
Right. And even with the younger, less mature leader, right, as you give them development assignments, you need to be present and support them as they're developing, right? It's not just, okay, we're going to move you into this new assignment because we think you're ready for it and go have at it, right? So it is a balance. It is a balance. So thanks for the point. I do appreciate that and the discussion.
I got one question for you. It just occurred to me, and I know your consulting practice is, being launched as we speak. But as you go into a company and work with leaders, as you described, is there any thought about working with employees who are working for a leader who is going through some semblance of grief? In other words, how, because they would need to be as cognizant as a leader would be in terms of what that leader is going through and how it might affect them and how that leader, he or she may see the world and all that. So I'm wondering whether or not your practice will evolve to like coaching even, subordinates, if you will.
Yes.
Because leadership is really defined maybe on an organizational chart, but then you've got these informal leaders too that are part of a group that, whether or not they have titular, titles or whatever. But how about the employee who's working for somebody who's grieving?
Right.
Is that something that you guys eventually, or maybe you are thinking about, addressing as you work with a particular company?
Yeah. If I won't go search for it, but if I put up our process chart, yes, that is an element because the team wants to help but doesn't know how. And they don't know how to engage the leader either. And so, yes, we would, in that instance, we would work with the leader because the same principles apply here, right? We would want the leader to be vulnerable and go to his team or her team and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. I'm going to need some help. And we would need to also help the team understand what this really looks like. In fact, it's one of the things that I've offered to the organization that I just described with the gentleman whose wife killed the 3 children, was to come in and actually talk to the employees and help them to understand what this person might be going through. And there's a very fine line there, right? We don't want to be grief counselors, and because we're not formally trained in that, and we certainly don't want leaders to become grief counselors. But there is an element here of recognizing and adapting our training to the employee level, right? Even as being engaged in a change management type situation. One of the things that we would recommend to organizations would be to have us adapt our training to actually bring it to the employee base and not just the leadership base, so that everybody's on the same page. So yeah. Yep.
Excellent.
All right. Well, I do appreciate it. Earl, good to see you again.
Always.
Dennis, thanks for joining again. Mark, as always, what a pleasure. I will clean this up a little bit and put it out on YouTube and put the link out on LinkedIn. And also we'll start to promote next month's session, which will get a little bit more granular on how to deal with this on from a true grief perspective, and also how, through the Adaptive Leadership Index, how you would know if you're an adaptive leader or not. So do appreciate it.
Would you jump to page 16, if you don't mind, because I've seen haven't seen my count. 16. Yeah, line 3, you have this type in the world people, put people.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
I do. Sorry. Thanks for catching that. Thanks for catching
No
that.
problem.
I will clean that up. I do appreciate that. Thanks. All right. Cool.
Great evening, day, morning, whatever.
Yeah. You guys too. Have a great weekend.
Have
See
a
ya.
good one. Talk to you
Bye.
gentlemen later.
Thanks.
Okay.